Hello and welcome to Money Life. Let's talk about the Jet Airways bailout this week. Many of you know, or many of you may be victims of the fact that Jet Airways suddenly found itself in serious trouble. Many of its flights were grounded. Many of us, including me, who had booked tickets, found our holidays cancelled, our hotel bookings in limbo, because suddenly the airline wasn't flying anymore. In fact, half its planes are grounded. It hasn't paid salaries to its staff. Some of them are threatening to go on strike. While all this was going on and there was a hue and cry on social media, there seems to have been this phone call from Delhi which asked bankers to find a solution. So the bankers met and they came up with a bailout plan. Now let's look at first of all whether this bailout was required. To my mind, yes, it was required because the bankers first of all created this situation where the airline was suddenly going to stop functioning. And we couldn't have had that. Let's face it, flying today is no longer a luxury. It is not limited to affluent people. It's an important part of aviation and public transport. So many very average middle class people are using airlines to get from one place to another. So we have the summer vacations coming up. People have booked their holidays 3 to 6 months in advance. Many of them plan to go abroad. Jet was flying overseas. Would all this have come to a stop? There was also a bigger problem. We have elections coming up. And let's face it, politicians need the airline as much as anybody else, because while their leaders may jet hop in private planes and charters, the rank and file which goes to prepare all the work for the rallies have to travel by air. And in these 20 days, you couldn't have had an airline collapsing. If you ask me, I think Jet was fully aware of it. And they knew that they can, play a game of brinksmanship, and it worked. So the bankers met and there was a bailout. Jet has been given 1,500 crore more, and they've been told that this is to pay debtors, pay salaries in a phased manner. So yes, a bailout was required. So let's look at what this bailout was, and is it good enough? Is it going to save the airlines, or is it going to just add to this humongous bad debt problem that India already has? Now, first of all, the bankers seem to have done one good thing. They converted just 1 rupee of debt into a 50.5% stake in the airline. So they didn't convert debt into equity. The debt of about 8,000 crores remains as it is. And they converted 1 rupee into equity. So they now have a stake of 50.5%, which sounds wonderful. They also announced that Naresh Goyal, the founder of Jet Airways, and his wife, who are directors, will step down both as directors and Naresh Goyal as chairman. This, of course, was made a big deal about because they put out a release where, a very emotional letter from Naresh Goyal where he talked about, no sacrifice being big enough for Jet. And people bought into it. So it looked like this wonderful, tough action, which actually it turns out it wasn't. So what we discover quite scarily is that the announcement to the Bombay Stock Exchange and the National Stock Exchange was incomplete, inadequate, and not the whole truth. Okay, it was part of the truth. So the chairman of State Bank of India, who had led this effort, Mr. Rajneesh Kumar, has been giving interviews all over the place after the deal was struck. And a lot of revelations were in this interview. One of those, which I'm going to refer to, is to the Economic Times. So what does he say to the Economic Times? That, yes, there's a bailout, 1,500 crore has been given. So now 8,000 crore has become 9,500 crore which Jet owes. The banks are sitting with 50%, which sounds like a lot of money. But the big secret which nobody talks about is that Mr. Naresh Goyal's stake halved. He still holds 25.5%. Etihad Airways, which had 25%, will still hold 12%, which means that between the two of them, you need a 26% shareholding to block a lot of important decisions that have to be passed through a special resolution by an annual general body meeting. And at this kind of meeting, Naresh Goyal is still more than capable of blocking things that don't look good to him. Obviously, the paper asks this question to Mr. Rajneesh Kumar, and he says, no, it's not that. There is a binding agreement with apparently Naresh Goyal as well as Etihad Airlines, where if required, Mr. Goyal will have to reduce his shareholding to 10% or less. So will Etihad. That is, if a new buyer comes in and he says, I don't want Mr. Goyal there, then he has to reduce his shareholding. Now, this is an obvious thing that's going to happen, right? So did bankers not anticipate it? Of course they did, because if you read what's happening all over the place, it is Mr. Goyal behind the scenes who is negotiating very hard to bring in an institutional investor, and he may come in behind him with his 25%, and Etihad, which didn't want to bid for more and was quiet, is suddenly back to neutral again, which means that it may or may not go along with Mr. Goyal. Now, if this happens, it is going to be a bit of a joke, because I told you they went out on a big emotional high and pretended that Mr. Goyal is out. He's not. He's very much in the picture. A very senior bureaucrat once told me called Mr. Goyal an ace manipulator. He says he's handled and dealt with him and been at the receiving end, and he knows what he's talking about. So is he in the picture? Yes, very much so. And we don't even know whether this is going to be a bailout, or, Mr. Rajneesh Kumar says in that interview that there may be a haircut. So imagine the irony that he may come in behind institutional investors. That's a possibility. And there may be a haircut also. If this happens, it would be most controversial, and it would make a mockery of this entire claim by the NDA government of having dealt with, in a tough way, with all defaulters. Now, here's another irony. Mr. Vijay Mallya ran away from the country, but do you know that his entire outstanding, of course, Kingfisher failed, he indulged in similar brinkmanship, left his, very hard-working employees in the lurch. The airline was grounded and he ran away. And he owes only 9,000 crore. Jet is already 9,500. Mr. Mallya is being pursued in the UK to bring him back. We even have videos of the jail in which he'll be lodged if he's brought in here. Why the difference in treatment between him and Mr. Goyal only because Mr. Goyal didn't run away abroad? That seems a little far-fetched, because we need to wait and see whether we are going to be taken for a ride again. Of course, there are a lot of people on social media and elsewhere who says Mr. Mallya is notorious, he flashed his wealth in the face of people. Yes, childish. And Mr. Goyal didn't do that. Mr. Goyal had a very humble profile and he didn't run away from the country. But does that mean he'll get a haircut of a few thousand crore? More importantly, is Jet Airways not controversial? I think I should refer you back to 2001, where Mr. Arun Shourie, then a minister of, again, an NDA government at that time, stood up in Parliament and made a statement which was about an IB report, an Intelligence Bureau report, which talked about the very dubious nature of Jet's shareholding. A whole bunch of shell companies, links to the underworld. Mr. Goyal at that time vehemently denied it, and the entire political establishment, cutting across parties, ensured that that whole controversy was buried, the IB officer transferred, and nothing's been heard about it as yet. Even today, no one wants to dig it up. Was he less controversial? Not at all. He was just not investigated like Mr. Mallya is. And we now have a situation where he is calling the shots behind the scenes. So the question is, are banks accountable or not? Because they are the ones who are sitting on this bad debt. They had a lot of opportunity to do things about it, but they don't seem to have done anything. I think it's time we ask a few questions. And let's look at what these questions are. Very pertinent, and it's going to play out in the next few days. So let me refer you to what a civil aviation expert, Mr. Jitendra Singhs, has been saying in a lot of television interviews, in a long talk, an interview with me. He's the man who exposed how the political establishment has allowed Air India to virtually collapse. Okay, it's got this huge debt. It's no longer the national carrier, the number one airline. And it's all discussed in a book called Descent of Air India. He has some very pertinent questions along with others. And let me talk about what they are. One is the lenders now say that they're going to do a bailout. They're going to find a solution. Question is, what were they doing all these days? Why did they not demand any equity or a board position until it was on the brink of failure? No answers. Second, they now say that they're going to have an interim committee and they're going to have experts who are going to ensure that Jet turns around. Lots of issues with the turnaround, including the fact that Jet runs a full service airline and charges just about 2 to 500 rupees more per seat than Indigo, which is now the market leader. And obviously there's a huge difference in profitability and costs. So we have no idea whether Jet is going to change its profile, how it's going to cut its costs, but we're told an interim committee is going to do all that. This includes a management consultant, an audit committee, and they're going to find answers in 6 short weeks, okay? Because 31st May seems to be the deadline that Mr. Rajneesh Kumar, SBI chairman, seems to have given himself. And what are the wonders that they're going to work? Because please remember that the Jet Airways board had 2 former civil aviation secretaries. Their names were Ashok Chawla and Nissim Zaidi. Now, if they couldn't do anything to save the airline when they were on the board, is a bunch of bankers going to be able to do any better? We don't know. The third question, wasn't it obvious to the board that running a full service airline was a problem? Why didn't they step in? Why did this board and the bankers allow Jet to acquire Sahara? Because Jet's serious problems began when it acquired Sahara Airlines. Sahara was also doddering. Jet Airways acquired it, which most people in the industry seem to think was nothing more than an ego kick. Until then, Jet had become the number 1 airline. It was losing ground to Indigo. It wanted to come back up with market share. So it acquired Sahara and it started, that component as a budget airline. Why were they allowed to do it when they were already not very profitable? No answers. Okay. Fourth question, and this is an interesting one. If there is a new buyer who comes in, will the Reserve Bank of India allow this buyer and the equity to be considered a new loan, a new acquisition, and will it not be considered a bad loan, or will there be a problem? Now, this becomes serious because there is an issue with Wilmar International acquiring Renuka Sugars, and Wilmar was already over there. It increased its stake in a bailout deal, issued corporate guarantees, and the RBI called it a related party and said that this won't do. All the loans will still be marked as bad debt. This has serious consequences to that company being able to borrow again. They're planning to sue the Reserve Bank of India. Here, the best bet so far is Etihad Airlines because it's sitting with 12%. So if Etihad wants to tie up with somebody else or increase its stake and help in bailing out or acquiring Jet Airways, it will run into the same problem as Wilmar and Renuka Sugars. So we have no clarity on that. And we have what Mr. Rajneesh Kumar says, a deal that will happen by 31st March. This bailout is more of a bailout for Naresh Goyal rather than Jet Airways. In fact, Jitendra Bhargav tweeted that if Mr. Goyal was asked to pen the bailout plan, would he have made it any different? Because everything works for him rather than for the country or for the banks or for us, the long-suffering travelers who have lost money in our tickets and the bookings that we have made. So it's not a very long time. Before 31st May, we will know the answer. My question is very simple. If it goes through, a great new buyer is coming in and he pays back the debt or at least agrees to acquire, responsibility for a big chunk of it, then Mr. Rajneesh Kumar and other bankers would have done a brilliant job and we all need to salute them. But if that doesn't happen, and if Mr. Naresh Goyal comes back in with an institution in front of him, then it's not only going to be a scandal, but I think this is the first time when we need to put bankers' accountability to the test. Here, Mr. Kumar has led from the front. He's put his name and reputation on the line. He has to be held personally accountable if it doesn't go through. And if there is a bailout of Mr. Goyal rather than a bailout of the airline. In the few days after this bailout has been announced, things are not looking very good. We are on the 3rd day. Pilots are still threatening to go on strike tomorrow. Yesterday, there was an announcement to the exchanges that they are not able to make payments, which means that we don't know whether any part of that 1,500 crore is transferred. We still don't have transparency on the so-called binding agreement and what it says, which means that this bailout is a work in progress and we will see which way it goes. Thank you.